Thanks for joining this webinar on Accounting Magic to manage multiple entities with ease. My name is Natalie from Orchid. Today I'm joined by Anne from Orchid as well as Nancy and Robert from RLA. For those of you who are not familiar with Robert Lavery and Associates, they've been distributing Orchid products in the Americas for the last 20 years and have been demonstrating and implementing Document Management Link and Int Entity for a long time. As we have discussed in a recent blog, the average Sage 300 site has 8 entities, and the largest manages over 800 entities in Sage 300. When Sage recently updated their product positioning checklist for business management solutions, one of the Sage 300 benefits they chose to highlight was its ability to manage complex finances for multiple companies. Sage 300 offers many advantages for companies running multiple entities. In this presentation, we will look at how Orchid products make this management even easier. And this may explain why over 1,000 Sage 300 sites used inter-entity transactions to manage their accounting processes. In today's presentation, Nancy looks at how Document Management Link supports better collaboration in the accounting team, and we're looking at an example in the accounts payable processes. Rob will then give us a detailed presentation on how to automate allocating expenses across multiple entities using Document Management Link and how this is supported by Document Management Link. Finally, Anne will present a scenario using the Sage 300 web screens to allocate rent received in Entity 1 on behalf of other entities and create the Learn account entries automatically. This will demonstrate that inter-entity works with the Sage 300 web screens as well as the desktop screens once they are configured. Over to you, Nancy.
So with Document Management Link, we thought we'd start with the invoice entry. That seems to be the popular place that people want to be able to view documents. And then later on, we'll show you Document Management Link working with inter-entity. So we're not changing anything about the underlying features of Sage 300. With Document Management Link, we are providing a link to where you're storing your documents to the screen of Sage 300. So in my case today, I'm using network folders. So on my network folders in my C drive, I've created a folder that I've called Orchid. And then I have a document folder, and then I have subfolders for each of the different types of documents that I want to store. And today we're going to focus on the AP documents where I'm storing documents by vendor. So you'll notice I have folders here for my vendor 1200, 1400, and 2150. This folder hierarchy would be completely up to you and how you want to be storing and viewing documents in Sage 300. But once you get this folder hierarchy in place, Document Management Link is sophisticated enough that it can begin to build out this folder structure for you. So in this example today, if I were to store a document around a vendor that does not currently have a folder, Document Management Link can create that folder and then file the document appropriately. So when we open up the AP invoice entry screen, you'll see the Document Management Link window appear beside the Sage screen. I've pinned it to the Sage screen, so as I move the Sage screen, you'll see the Document Management Link window move with it. If I were to minimize this screen, then the Document Management Link window will minimize as well to make it easier for users to keep track of the documents they're viewing against any particular screen. If you're using multiple companies and you've color-coded those companies, you'll notice the Document Management Link will mimic that color coding as well. So in the first window, we have the link to our vendor number. So again, we're linking to the vendor number field, and then based on the value within that field, it knows which folder contents to display. So we're seeing those documents that are currently stored in the vendor 1200 folder. If that value were to change to 1400, I'll then be able to see the contents of the vendor 1400 folder. Now, what we've done in the second window is we're doing filtering against the contents of the vendor number folder. So in this example, I want to easily be able to see the documents that relate to this particular AP invoice entry. So although I'm storing those documents in the vendor folder, I want to use the document number to filter what I'm viewing in this window. So I've done a configuration around two fields, the vendor number and the document number field. So typically when a user is entering a transaction, this is when they would be attaching documents. So when I hover over the document management link window, you'll notice the add button will appear. I can click on that button and it will take me out into my environment. So I can get anywhere within my environment to grab a document that I want to attach here. I could also attach an email, so I can drag the entire email as an EML file, or I could drag an attachment off of an email and then have that refiled in the appropriate folder. But in this case, I've got a suspense folder where I'm just going to scan all of my documents into one folder. So the users that are entering transactions go to one repository to find the document that they need. And then I'm going to click on that document, drag it, and drop it over the document management link window. Now, in my example, the invoice has stayed in my suspense folder for demo purposes, but in a real life scenario, you don't necessarily want to have multiple copies of the same document. So you can just hold the Shift key on your keyboard when you do that drag and drop, and it will move the document rather than copy it. The other thing you may have noticed is it changed the name of the document to INV 12345. That is based on the value in the document number field. So this is an optional configuration where you can specify that you want to rename a document based on the value within a field, in this case, the document number field. So you'll see that the invoice is actually stored in my vendor folder, but I'm filtering against that folder and I can just see the documents that relate to this particular entry. I can add as many documents here as I like. If I drag that same Excel file in, it's going to say, well, you've already got a document named INV 12345. That's an Excel file. So did you drag an incorrect document and you want to overwrite what's there? Or do you want to put date parameters or a -1? So, -1, -2, and so on. So you can file as many documents as you like this way. If I drag a different file type in, then it's just going to rename that file for me. You can attach any type of document through the document management link window, because we're just providing that link from where you're storing the document, and we're displaying it here through the document management link window. So as long as a user has the necessary program, they can open any document through the document management link window. Now, the next window here is a configuration around the purchase order number. So this is linked to the purchase order number field on the AP invoice entry screen. Now, I would have attached these documents in the purchase order module, but I want to be able to view those here in accounts payable as well. So you can store the document against one screen, but configure the software to say, I want to see those documents against all screens where that information appears. So in this case, any screen that the purchase order number appears on, I want to be able to see the backup documents related to that particular purchase order. In the fourth window, I've done a configuration around the GL account, and that's the GL account here in the entry grid. And that's illustrating that you can link documents to the entry grid fields as well. So with Document Management Link, you can link documents to any field on any screen in any module of Sage 300 and any third-party product that is inside your Sage environment. And you're about to see Document Management Link working with the Orchid Inner Entity product. So certainly those documents will link with any Orchid product and any other third-party product that you find inside your Sage 300 environment. Now, just to show you a follow through, I've done some configuration in the general ledger as well, because I want to be able to see these documents when they get posted up to the GL. So I've just posted that AP batch up to the general ledger, and here's the journal entry that's been created by that. And what I've done is I want to illustrate that you can get creative. So I've mentioned that you can view documents against a screen that has the information, natively on that screen. The purchase order number was our example. But I wanted to illustrate that you can get creative, as I've done in this case with the GL journal entry. I'm passing the vendor number into the reference field, and I'm choosing to pass the purchase order number into the description field. So I can do configurations in Document Management Link around those fields, and you'll see that I'm able to see those vendor documents here, as well as the purchase order documents, in addition to any documents I want to store around my GL account. And I wanted to illustrate that you can also store documents around batch numbers. So, a batch number, some of your document numbers are going to be auto-generated numbers. So you can generate, in this case, the batch number or a purchase order number, and then link documents to that as well. So if you want to see documents at a higher level, at a batch level, then you could link to a batch number and store documents there. And then, of course, if I don't want to pass the vendor number and purchase order number into these fields, I could also easily drill back into the underlying screens, in our case, the AP invoice entry. So that's some examples of the document management link. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Rob, who can show you the document management link working against InterEntity.
All right, that was great, Nancy. Wonderful overview of document management link. And now we want to walk you through the inter-entity transactions module from Orchid. This has got to be my favorite solution from Orchid systems. This is the one solution that I can guarantee will save your clients hours, if not days, by eliminating the need to do manual reconciliation of the due to, due from intercompany loan accounts. As a quick review, let me just highlight a couple of the setup options so you understand the power of what inter-entity transactions is doing for you. To understand that value, you need to recognize that what inter-entity transactions is doing is balancing the debits and credits for your intercompany transactions at an individual segment level. So you need to have at least one of your segments identified as a company or balancing segment, whether you're allocating expenses, allocating revenue, or moving money between companies. And you can do this at a company level within one Sage 300 company database, or you can move these transactions across one or more extra Sage 300 company databases. And so by balancing at an individual segment level, the system will identify transactions that go across companies. And for a nonprofit, it could be funds. It could also be things like product lines, divisions, or departments, depending on the organizational structure that you want to support these transactions in. And once you've defined the segment, you then define the individual segment codes that represent those different entities, whether they be companies, funds, product lines, departments, or divisions. And once you've established that, then you have the ability to process transactions within one Sage 300 company database, or you can allow inter-database processing to facilitate transactions moving from one or more Sage 300 company databases. In addition to the ability to allocate revenue or allocate expenses, I mentioned the ability to manage cash as well. I'm going to be giving you a short example of a bank transfer entry, but just so you know, we can also receive money through AR receipts on behalf of a related company and also send money or make payments on behalf of a related party. Once we've established the setup options, we would want to link the accounts, which establishes the relationship between the various companies. So as an example, a linked account will set up the loan account, which recognizes the intercompany receivable in company 2, denoted by the -2, which is receivable from company 1. And that should always be in balance with the intercompany payable in company 1, denoted by the -1, which is payable to company 2. So company 2's receivable from company 1 should always equal company 1's payable to company 2. And then we establish a transaction route, which determines how we're moving these transactions between the companies or entities. In the case where there's a direct relationship, then we have a one-step route. So in this case, any transactions moving from company 1 to company 5 will just require a direct relationship, and we're not clearing entries through a subsidiary, parent company, or management company. But in the case where I'm moving transactions between entity 1 and entity 3, you can see how we're able to clear these loan account transactions through a intermediary company. Again, whether that's a parent company or a management company, holding company, depending on the hierarchical structure of the organization that is using Sage 300. So we're moving entries from company 1 to company 2, and then from company 2 to company 3. And you can create as many different levels as you need to in order to facilitate these entries. In the case where the companies or funds are part of a separate Sage 300 company database, then that entity code that we set up can be designated as another online database. We point to the org ID for the company database. We specify a source type for the entries that will be created in the general ledger of that target company. We assign a user ID. Now, typically you wouldn't use the admin user ID. You would want to use something like inter-entity or inter-company or something to denote a specific user with specific rights to be able to create these GL batches in the target companies. And then you can also specify, once that general ledger batch has been created, do I want to leave it open as a batch that can be reviewed and edited prior to posting? Or would I like to auto-post that transaction batch automatically once it hits the target company? Now, in the example where the database that I want to send these transactions to is not online, then the system allows me to create an export file that I can then email or send over to that external company database, and they can use that file attachment to import the transactions into the offline general ledger company database. So whether we're connected on the same network or not, we can still manage intercompany transactions with related party companies. So let's go through the example of accounts payable, and I'll leverage the example that Nancy used in her presentation on Document Management Link to highlight how we can not only create an expense allocation entry within a company, but using Document Management Link, we're able to share that same document, in this case an AP invoice, with the related party company that's receiving a portion of the expense that we're going to be paying on their behalf by recording the AP invoice within our company. So to do that, I want to highlight a couple of the other features within Sage 300 and Inter-Entity. So let's do an allocation of office supplies. And I'll record that transaction like a standard AP invoice entry. And this is one of the other beauties of the Inter-Entity Transactions module. Once you configure the application, Inter-Entity does its work in the background. we're not really changing the way your clients are entering their AP invoice transactions. We're using the same AP invoice entry screen. The only difference, and you'll see this in just a moment, is that we're going to record the transaction and do the expense allocation on the original entry of the AP invoice. Now you also notice that as I entered the vendor number, immediately Document Management Link springs into action, showing me all of the invoices that we've recorded against vendor 1200. And then as soon as I enter the invoice number, let's say 651, it gives me a separate window within Document Management Link to have the specific invoice for this transaction. So not only can I show all invoices for that vendor, but now I have the option to create the invoice for this specific entry. And as Nancy showed, I can explore and see all the transactions stored in the folder against that vendor. So again, I'm also using network folders, but when I've got a new invoice that I want to add, by clicking or dragging that document into the window, it immediately renames the document to match the document number I've entered in this field. Okay? So it's a very powerful tool to be able to support transaction documents in the system. Okay, so it looks like I need to add an additional record here. So I will add this again. Now you notice that it's called Approved Emergency Form, but it renames it, as Nancy showed, to the information that we've stored within that document number field. So what I want to do is also then show you the power of using InterEntity with the distribution set capabilities of Sage 300 Accounts Payable. Let's say that my invoice total is $2,000, but I want to allocate this across two companies. So I can have an intercompany distribution set that's already set up, and I'm going to use the two-company distribution set. So if you're not familiar with this functionality, very briefly, under the AP setup, you have distribution codes where I can use an alphanumeric description to allocate expenses to a GL account. But distribution sets takes that one step further by allowing you to define in advance across multiple GL accounts a distribution percentage, spread evenly, a manual allocation, or a fixed amount. So in the case where you're doing intercompany transactions and having to allocate these transactions across multiple accounts and even multiple companies, taking advantage of the distribution sets is a very handy tool. It allows you to predefine the percent allocation, whether you're going to be allocating 100% of the invoice or not. And when I click the Create Distribution button, you notice how it populates those line details for me automatically. And in this case, because I'm using InterEntity, I've set up the accounts with the -1, -2 to denote the different entities that I want to allocate this expense to. So in this case, I'm not using the purchase of inventory, so I'll delete that line. Now, for those of you that belong to jurisdictions with value-added taxes, you notice that the tax amount's been allocated as well. In some cases, you might not want to allocate the tax because of the input tax credit that companies can accrue when they record AP invoices and they're paying those expenses on behalf of related parties. So what you might want to do in those cases is remove the tax that's been allocated to the other entity and set up the tax to be 100% recorded in the company that's recording the AP invoice. Now, in my case, I'm actually going to eliminate the tax entirely on this transaction in order to keep the expense allocation simple. But this is all it takes to set up the AP invoice. I allocate between the two companies $1,200 to company one, $800 to company two, which gives me my total of $2,000. I add this as a transaction, and it's now going to be recorded and posted up to my general ledger. An invoice 6517 that's been attached here in accounts payable you'll now see the power of Document Management Link storing that document outside of Sage 300, so that all I need to do is store it once, but now I'll be able to reference that same document from multiple screens, not only within this Sage 300 company, but also the related party company database. So I post my AP invoice up to my general ledger, and I now have a GL batch that's been created within what we call the source company. So by opening my batch list, I'll see the amount of $2,000 coming up from AP. When I open the batch, I'll see the recording of the transaction to the AP trade account. And you notice that the invoice that I set up against my AP invoice transaction in the AP subledger is also represented here as a document attachment against my GL batch. The integration settings allow us to create a reference to the vendor number as well as the description of the invoice or document details. Those integration settings are part of inter-entity transactions and allow us to add to the audit trail information that's recorded with the transaction. And you'll see how the reference and description can also be passed over to the target company when we move the transaction from entity 1 to entity 2. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight here is the source type. You notice that this is AP invoice source type, and I have a balanced entry of $2,000 worth of credits against $2,000 worth of debits. However, the issue for us is that because inter-entity is installed, it's going to identify the fact that instead of having just a balanced entry, it's actually balancing at the individual segment level. So it sees the transaction slightly differently. It sees a source credit of $2,000 being posted to the Company 1 AP Trade Control account, and then a debit of $1,200 being recorded to Company 1's Office Supplies expense account. Because inter-entity is balancing at the individual segment, it's identified the fact that we're actually out of balance by a debit of $800. So what inter-entity is going to do is it's going to add a line to this batch and record an $800 debit, which is going to be recorded into a Company 1 account, intercompany loan account receivable that's due from Company 2, and it will identify the transaction line with an IY source type. So the message here is that you now no longer manually enter transactions into the loan accounts. You let inter-entity transactions automatically set up the loan accounts to balance the entries at the company or segment level. And that way, you never have to manually reconcile the due to, due froms anymore. Because once you have those loan accounts in balance, inter-entity transactions, by definition, will be balancing those loan accounts, debits and credits across companies or across departments automatically every time you post a transaction that has intercompany implications. So likewise, when it looks at this third line in the GL batch, I have an $800 debit in Company 2 with no offsetting credit. So again, inter-entity will add a line for an $800 credit to a Company 2 account, which is the intercompany payable that's due from Company 1 in Company 2's books, and that will also have the IY source type associated with it. So you'll always be able to see the lines in a batch that inter-entity transactions has created for you. So this is what we like to call the accounting magic, where the system automatically identifies transactions that need to be balanced through the loan accounts, adds those lines to the transaction batch, and then because Company 2 is a separate company database, it's going to take the office supplies expense for Company 2 of $800 and the intercompany payable that's due from Company 1 in Company 2's books of $800 and set up those entries within Company 2's general ledger for us automatically. And then because we have document management link configured here in the source company, but also in the target company, a copy of the invoice from the original AP invoice entry will be sent over to Company 2's database as well. So if that doesn't get accountants excited, I don't know what will. Now, you know what they say about accountants, that accountants are not boring people. They just get excited about boring things. But this is definitely not a boring thing. This makes accounting fun and, if you will, quite magical. So what I want to do now is I want to post this entry into my general ledger of the source company, Company 1 or Orc Limited. And as I post the entry, you'll see some additional lines of transaction detail will be added. So it balances the entries through the inter-entity processing. It exports the expense line required over to Company 2's database. And then you see the additional lines of entry that have been recorded to the loan accounts here in Company 1. So I mentioned that we have a different source type. The IY source type is now recorded as part of the transaction. So if I expand the window and we move across again to show you the accounts and the source types, I'll just review this one more time before we show you the effects of the entry in Company 2. So we started off with our original AP invoice transaction from the AP subledger, crediting AP trade $2,000, a debit of $1,200 to office supplies expense in Company 1, and then you see the entry recorded in Company 1's books, which is the intercompany receivable due from Company 2 of $800. And there's my balanced entry within Company 1. And the loan account entry designated with an IY source type. And likewise, the office supplies expense for Company 2 has been set up and balanced against a loan account entry in Company 2, which is a payable due to Company 1 in Company 2's books, and that also has the IY source type. So there's your accounting magic. Now, it's fair to say that the expense account 7900-2 is an account that's been set up within Company 1's GL chart of accounts. And that's because we need that expense account set up in order to create the intercompany transaction balancing entries that inter-entity generates through those loan accounts. Now, there is another way to do that, what we call GL entity substitution, where I can use an optional field, or what we've done here using Extender, we've actually added the entity optional field as a separate column in the grid. And what I could have done instead is I could have designated that expense to go to entity 2 rather than set up a separate account for each of the expenses that I want to allocate to Company 2. So that is another option for clients that don't want their chart of accounts to get too large. You can actually use entity substitution, which is what we call a GL trigger. And that GL trigger can be set up here, where any of my 6,000 expense accounts could be allocated to different target entities. And you just need to set up one to manage multiple entities. And it would automatically clear through an inter-entity clearing account to balance the entry. And then when it arrives in the target account database, it would reverse out the clearing account and allocate it to the real expense account that we used. So it is possible to use GL entity substitution as a way to avoid creating a bunch of different expense accounts in the source company for all of the other companies it wants to allocate expenses to. But now the magic. This is where we pull the rabbit out of the hat and we show you the effect of inter-entity transactions moving a loan account entry with the related expense over to the GL in the target company. So this is the transaction batch that we created off our office supplies expense transaction in Company 1. And in Company 2, you can see the reference to the vendor number, the description for the vendor's document, and voila, document management link is showing you the supporting document for that invoice against this GL transaction batch, which validates the expense allocation that Company 2 has received of $800 off this $2,000 invoice originally set up in Company 1. And there's the loan account entry, so we have a balanced transaction in the GL for that loan account entry. Now, because we also have a trigger to do what we call AR reallocations, what we could have done is when we posted the GL transaction in Company 1, instead of sending over an intercompany expense allocation to the general ledger in the target company, we could have actually created an AR invoice rather than set up an intercompany receivable in the loan account in the GL. And then using inter-entity trade, that AR invoice in Company 1 would have created an AP invoice in Company 2. So it is possible to allocate expenses and create subledger entries through what we call reallocation entries in inter-entity transactions. And we could still use Document Management Link to show the supporting documents on those entries. They would just be recorded now against AR and AP invoice entries rather than in the GL against loan account entries. So that's how we manage expense allocations using inter-entity transactions and Document Management Link to move supporting documents between the company databases. Now, to finish off the presentation today, I'd like to complete the loop on how we would manage those loan accounts. Typically, where you're not generating AR and AP invoices across intercompany, you have loan account balances that need to be reconciled and then eventually cleared. So inter-entity transactions does come with a loan account balance inquiry. And this supports multiple currencies if these related party company GLs are in different currencies. But what this does is it identifies for you the fact that all of my loan accounts will be in balance when the source debits on one side equal the source credits on the other side. So as long as I'm not seeing any discrepancies here, I know that I'm completely in balance across all of my companies. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an actual balance outstanding. And so what companies typically do is they do a bank transfer to move funds from one company to another to clear out an outstanding intercompany loan payable, or in the case where they just want to move funds between companies. So let's say I want to do a bank transfer from, I'm going to use Orc Ltd, which is the company I'm in now, and set that up to Orc Inc. IN2. And this is also going to highlight the multi-currency functionality that's supported, because inter-entity transactions is not changing the way Sage 300 processes entries. It's just automating the process for you. Now here, where we want to do a bank transfer entry, we're taking the money from the bank here in Orc Limited, and we want to send it over to the bank within Entity 2. But what this account is actually a bank clearing account that we set up in Company 1. And then what we do as part of the setup within inter-entity transactions is we map the clearing account in Company 1 that represents the real bank account in Company 2. So by mapping the clearing account to the actual bank account in Company 2, the system knows how to set up the transaction properly in both companies. Now, the other benefit of doing it this way is that as I enter the transaction, so let's clear out the $800 payable, let's say, it will convert to the equivalent in the currency of the GL that we're depositing the money to. And all I need to do is post. And by posting the entry, because we're doing this in bank services, it's going to create a withdrawal entry as we move the money from Company 1 and do a deposit entry in bank services of Company 2, which means that these entries will automatically appear on the bank rec in each company's. And because we can auto post the transactions, the bank entries get posted up to the GL automatically if you choose to configure the system that way. So now within bank services, I have a bank transaction, which was the bank transfer is now recorded as a bank entry here in the source company, company one. And because we were moving money from this company, I see the entry posted in the US dollar equivalent and the $800 Canadian equivalent. And I'm doing a withdrawal, which is a credit into the bank account of Orc Limited, offset by the loan account entry, a debit to the loan account. So credit the bank account for withdrawal and debit the loan account to draw down the outstanding payable. That's how we manage the entry within company one. And now when we move over to company two, we'll see that a bank entry has been created and automatically posted up to the general ledger. So let's just go to the general ledger. We see the bank entry that's been recorded, and this will show you that the money has been properly deposited. And again, if I had specific transaction fields that I wanted to attach, as I enter the bank entry in company one, I could have supporting documentation if there was any document that I wanted to record. But again, notice the reference is giving us the description from the original bank transfer entry. And we've set up the debit to their bank account to acknowledge the money that was transferred to them, and the loan account entry to balance that. And then if I drill from GL back into bank services, there's my deposit entry within bank services, acknowledging the debit to the bank and the credit to the loan account entry. And again, you see documents that could be popping here in company two against the original bank transfer entry. So there you go. Inter-entity transactions, a wonderful tool to help your clients keep their loan accounts in balance, to avoid manually reconciling the due to and due from entries, and being able to allocate expenses, allocate revenue, and move money between companies right through bank services automatically with no rekeying, no importing, exporting, to eliminate key errors and having to generate transactions manually in two or more companies for the same entry. We hope that you've enjoyed this presentation on inter-entity transactions.
And just as Rob used accounts payable and inter-entity transactions to record expenses to be distributed amongst multiple companies, we can use accounts receivable and inter-entity transactions to record receivables against multiple companies. And I'm using the Sage 300 web screens. We are going to create a new batch. For our customer 42350, the Manly Sea Eagles Cafe, and we're going to record the rent, a portion of which is for entity 1 and a portion of which is for entity 2. This is a summary invoice, and using the distribution codes Rent 1 and Rent 2 for the correct general ledger accounts, we're going to record $1,200 for entity 1 and $800 for entity 2. And go ahead and post that batch. And in the general ledger, if we open up this batch, we can see the debit to the accounts receivable control, credit to company 1's rent received, and credit to company 2's rent received. And just like in the accounts payable example, when you post a general ledger batch, because inter-entity transactions works at the GL level, it will automatically balance the entities using the configured loan accounts. So we have the credit of 800 to Entity 1's books, debit to Entity 2's books to balance the loan account entries in Company 1, and then transferring these two amounts to Company 2. And connecting through to Company 2, in the GL transactions, we have the general ledger batch that has been sent by Company 1, which could have been auto-posted. And we have got the credit to the rent revenue account and the debit to the loan account with Company 1.
Thanks Nancy, Rob and Anne for your magical presentations. We've seen how Document Management Link can be used simply to share documents across accounting processes and across companies. We've also demonstrated how inter-entity transaction helps you keep entities in balance at all times, automatically, based on highly configurable rules. Transactions can be entered on the Sage 300 desktop screens as well as the web screens. Sage 300 has many advantages for companies with multiple entities, in particular when combined with Orchid modules such as Inter-Entity and Document Management Link. We also recently demonstrated how Process Scheduler can help companies with multiple entities automate some regular tasks, such as posting batches and opening and closing fiscal periods, which in Process Scheduler lets you perform such tasks from a single company. Our reporting tools, Info Explorer and Report Runner, also help you do your reporting more easily across multiple companies. Thank you for your time. For more information on Orchid products, in particular Inter-Entity and Document Management Link, please refer to our website https://www.orchid.systems. And now let's go to Q&A. Thank you. Nancy has shown us how we can use Document Management Link in a flexible manner in accounts payable and also view the documents in the general ledger. You can also use a similar configuration to view documents in accounts receivable and obviously other modules, but in the context of supporting inter-entity transactions, we can use accounts receivable as well. So we've demonstrated various subledgers, AP using the desktop screens, and Anne showed us how to use the web screens and accounts receivable to create the balancing entries. As an update, most of you are probably aware that we released the web screens for EFT processing for AP and AR in June, and we are currently developing the web screens for Document Management Link. So stay tuned for more details in the next few months after the release of version 2022. So that means you will then be able to use we've shown you using Document Management Link and Inter-Entity transactions on the desktop screens. You'll be able to do the same thing on the web screens. So if you have any questions, please put them in the questions box. And while you're typing your questions, I will hand over to Anne as the presenter to show us, to answer some of the questions. And the first question I see here is, can I use all the inter-entity screens on the web screens? Or are the web screens available for inter-entity?
No, they're not yet available for inter-entity. We've still to do our inter-entity transactions web screens. So all these inquiries that you're seeing on my screen now, the audit inquiries for inter-entity or the triggers or trade audit inquiries or cash management audit inquiries, the periodic processing which you use to send a transaction through to a target database if there was an error in the first round, and your reports, and of course the setup screens. These all need to happen on the Sage 300 desktop. But then, because inter-entity transactions works at the view level, i.e. at the server level, if your source transactions for AR, AP, OE, IC, PO, etc., or general ledger are in the web screens, the work is still done on the server by inter-entity transactions, and it creates the documents accordingly, which can then be viewed or processed either on the desktop screens or on the web screens. But the setup needs to be done at this point on the desktop screens. Another question here. Will DML web screens use the same setup as desktop or use a different HTTP versus URL for the network drive? Good question, Jaime, because of course security for the web client is different than being logged in as a user, and we're still working through what we're going to be doing there. So stay tuned, we'll let you know. Was that a trick question, Jaime? I think it was. Can you see any other questions, Natalie?
Can't see any other questions at this point. So as usual, we will send you a recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. And if you have any questions on what you have seen, you can contact Nancy or Rob, and obviously us as well on support@orchid.systems. And if you want to stay tuned for something else, then come and join our next webinar in September. We haven't decided on the topic yet, so just one last question. What about adding other fields to entity for OE as tracking number?
I think what you're referring to here is the ability to map tracking number between OE sales orders and PO purchase orders. And I believe that's already covered. So if we look at our trade options, so in the trade options on the OE-PO document integration, this is where you map from your source, in this case, sales order to purchase order. This is where you map the fields, what you want to send. So do we have tracking number? Yeah, we've got detailed tracking number and the document tracking number. So from my sales order, I can map the document tracking number or the detailed tracking number to any one of the PO fields that are in the map. So I think that one's covered. You should be okay with tracking number.
And if you have tried it and have issues with it, just send us an email to support and we'll look at it more closely. And that relates obviously to inter-entity trade, which wasn't really covered in this webinar and will be the subject of the forthcoming webinar.